In the summer of 2008, the disappearance of 2-year-old Caylee Anthony from Orlando, Florida, captivated the nation. Her mother, Caylee Anthony, was charged with her murder, leading to a highly publicized trial. Today, we delve into the details of this case, exploring the events that unfolded, the trial, and its lasting impact on the community. On June 15, 2008, the last known sighting of 2-year-old Caylee Anthony was reported. Her mother, Caylee Anthony, was seen with her daughter at the Anthony family home in Orlando, Florida. In the days that followed, there were no further reports of Caylee being seen or heard from, and yet Caylee did not report her daughter as missing. It wasn't until over a month later, on July 15th, that Caylee's disappearance was officially reported by her grandmother, Cindy Anthony. During this critical period, Caylee's behavior raised suspicions. While the public assumed that a mother would be frantic in the face of her child's sudden disappearance, Caylee seemed indifferent, even carefree. She was seen out socializing, drinking, and partying with friends, almost as though nothing had happened. In fact, on July 3rd, Caylee was spotted attending a nightclub where she partied the night away without any apparent concern for her missing daughter. This unusual behavior contrasted sharply with the usual frantic searches and emotional turmoil expected from a mother in such a situation. As time passed, Caylee's actions grew increasingly suspicious. She claimed that Caylee had been taken by a nanny named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, a woman she said had been caring for Caylee for some time. However, when investigators followed up on this lead, they found no evidence of such a woman ever existing. The inconsistencies in Caylee's story began to pile up, but she continued to insist that Caylee was still alive and that she was simply unable to find her. Despite Caylee's claims, the public began to question her motives. The longer she waited to report Caylee missing, the more people speculated about her involvement in her daughter's disappearance. Her demeanor, lack of urgency, and refusal to cooperate fully with law enforcement only fueled the suspicion that she might have known more about Caylee's fate than she was letting on. This lack of concern was alarming to those around her, and as more days passed without any solid evidence of where Caylee was, the investigation into her disappearance intensified. By the time Caylee was reported missing, it was already clear that something wasn't adding up, and the search for answers had only just begun. As soon as Caylee was officially reported missing, law enforcement agencies jumped into action. The investigation quickly shifted into high gear as authorities attempted to piece together the few clues they had. The public, along with local law enforcement, anxiously awaited any sign of Caylee. However, as the days turned into weeks, the mystery surrounding her disappearance only deepened. On August 11, 2008, a significant break in the case came when a meter reader named Roy Kronk discovered a child's skeletal remains in a wooded area just a quarter-mile from the Anthony family home. The location was somewhat remote and overgrown, and it wasn't a place typically frequented by the public. The remains were partially covered by leaves and other debris, indicating they had been there for some time. As investigators quickly arrived on the scene, they were confronted with a grim discovery. The body was that of a young child. Authorities immediately began to work with forensic specialists to confirm the identity of the remains. DNA testing was performed, and the results confirmed what many had feared. These were the remains of 2-year-old Caylee Anthony. The discovery of her body led to an intense wave of emotions and stirred up even more questions. How did Caylee end up there? Why was she not reported missing until weeks after her disappearance? And most chillingly, who was responsible for her death? As the investigation deepened, it became clear that Caylee Anthony, Caylee's mother, was the center of suspicion. Authorities began to question her actions and inconsistencies in her statements. While Caylee had insisted that Caylee had been kidnapped by a nanny, there was no evidence of any such nanny ever existing. Additionally, her refusal to give detailed answers only raised more questions. The pressure mounted on Caylee, and law enforcement ramped up their efforts, searching the family's home and property for any other possible evidence. In the coming days, investigators would sift through all available evidence, CCTV footage, cell phone records, and more, hoping to find something that could help explain the tragic death of Caylee Anthony. As the investigation progressed, the inconsistencies in Caylee Anthony's statements became impossible to ignore. Despite her claims that Caylee had been taken by a fictional nanny, there was no evidence to support her story. In fact, it only became clearer that Caylee was concealing something. By early October 2008, investigators had gathered enough to charge Caylee with serious crimes, including the murder of her daughter. On October 14th, 2008, Caylee Anthony was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, aggravated manslaughter of a child, and aggravated child abuse. The arrest followed a grand jury indictment, which was based on evidence that suggested Caylee was directly involved in her daughter's death. Authorities had also gathered information that indicated Caylee had lied repeatedly to investigators about the circumstances surrounding Caylee's disappearance. As the news of her arrest spread, the public was shocked. Many wondered how a mother could be accused of such a horrific crime against her own child. The arrest itself was chaotic, with a large crowd of media and onlookers gathering outside the Anthony family home. Caylee's parents, George and Cindy Anthony, were devastated by the news. They had stood by their daughter throughout the investigation, insisting that Caylee was innocent, but now the reality was setting in. The case had gone from a missing child report to a murder investigation, and the spotlight was squarely on Caylee. Her behavior during this period only deepened the public's suspicions. While in custody, Caylee continued to maintain her innocence. She stuck to the story of the nanny and claimed that Caylee was still alive, although there was no evidence to support this. The strain of the situation seemed to weigh heavily on her, and her emotional state fluctuated between anger, defiance, and what some perceived as a lack of remorse. As she faced the charges, Caylee's legal team was already preparing for what would become one of the most high-profile and controversial trials in recent history. The arrest of Caylee Anthony marked the beginning of a long and intense legal battle, with the world watching closely as the case unfolded. The trial of Caylee Anthony began on May 24, 2011 at the Orange County Courthouse in Orlando, Florida. What started as a missing child case had evolved into a murder trial that captured the attention of the nation. News outlets, journalists, and the public flocked to the courthouse as they eagerly awaited the proceedings. For many, the trial was an emotional roller coaster, as the details of Caylee Anthony's death were about to be revealed in full. The prosecution's argument was clear and straightforward. Caylee Anthony intentionally killed her daughter. Prosecutors argued that Caylee's death was not an accident, but a deliberate act by a mother who had grown tired of her responsibilities. They pointed to Caylee's behavior in the days following Caylee's disappearance, her partying, her lies, and the fact that she failed to report her daughter missing until weeks later, as evidence that she knew more than she let on. They also pointed to the forensic evidence, including traces of chloroform found in Caylee's car, and the fact that Caylee's remains were found close to the family home, suggesting that her death occurred not far from where she lived. The defense, however, took a very different approach. Caylee's attorneys argued that Caylee's death was a tragic accident. They suggested that the 2-year-old had drowned in the family pool, and that Caylee, in a state of panic, had covered up the accident, fearing how her father, George Anthony, might react. The defense also introduced another layer of complexity. They suggested that Caylee had been sexually abused by her father, George, which they argued may have contributed to her mental state and decisions. George vehemently denied these allegations, and no evidence was presented to support the claims of sexual abuse. As the trial unfolded, both sides presented extensive testimony, including emotional statements from witnesses, experts, and even family members. The prosecution painted a picture of a cold and calculating mother who had no qualms about ending her child's life, while the defense portrayed Caylee as a distressed, overwhelmed woman who made poor decisions in a moment of panic. The courtroom drama unfolded over 6 weeks, with dramatic moments, conflicting expert testimony, and heart-wrenching footage. Every twist and turn in the case seemed to reveal a new layer of deception or confusion. By the end of the trial, both sides had presented their cases, and it was now up to the jury to decide whether Caylee Anthony would be convicted of the murder of her daughter. The trial had become a media spectacle, but it was clear that the central question, what happened to Caylee, was far from being resolved. After more than 6 weeks of emotional testimony, expert analysis, and dramatic courtroom moments, the trial of Caylee Anthony came to a close. On July 5, 2011, the jury began deliberating Caylee's fate. The nation held its breath as the case that had captured widespread attention neared its conclusion. The courtroom was tense with anticipation, with spectators, journalists, and those following the trial anxiously waiting for the final decision. The prosecution had argued that Caylee Anthony had intentionally killed her daughter Caylee and had gone to great lengths to cover up the crime. They pointed to circumstantial evidence such as the chloroform found in Caylee's car and the fact that Caylee's body had been dumped near the family home. They painted a picture of a mother who had acted out of selfishness and a desire to be free of the burden of motherhood. On the other hand, the defense had maintained that Caylee's death was an accident, a tragic drowning in the family pool, and that Caylee had panicked and attempted to cover it up. The defense also introduced the controversial claim of sexual abuse by Caylee's father, George Anthony, though this allegation was fiercely denied and remained unproven. Finally, after hours of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed with people waiting for the moment that would determine whether Caylee Anthony would be held accountable for the death of her daughter. When the verdict was read aloud, it stunned many. The jury found Caylee Anthony not guilty of first-degree murder, not guilty of aggravated manslaughter of a child, and not guilty of aggravated child abuse. The only conviction was for 4 counts of providing false information to law enforcement, for which she was sentenced to time already served. The not guilty verdict was met with an outpouring of shock and disbelief. Many felt that justice had not been served and that the truth of what happened to Caylee had not been fully uncovered. The decision sparked an intense public debate. How could a mother be acquitted of killing her own child? How could the evidence presented in court not be enough to convict her? For many, it was a frustrating and heartbreaking conclusion, especially since the truth about Caylee's death remained unclear. In contrast, Caylee Anthony, who had been facing the possibility of life in prison or even the death penalty, was released after the trial. She had spent almost 3 years in jail awaiting trial, but now, as she left the courtroom, she faced an uncertain future. The verdict became a divisive topic, and people around the world expressed strong opinions on both sides of the case. While some believed Caylee's innocence, others were convinced that she had gotten away with murder. The trial was over, but the questions lingered. Who killed Caylee? Why did Caylee act the way she did? And would the truth ever come to light? The aftermath of the Caylee Anthony trial was as dramatic and polarizing as the case itself. On July 17, 2011, just days after her acquittal, Caylee Anthony was released from jail, having served nearly 3 years awaiting trial. Her release was met with a media frenzy. Journalists and cameras flooded the area surrounding the jail, eager to capture her first moments of freedom. But despite the public's overwhelming interest in her life post-trial, Caylee Anthony largely disappeared from the public eye. She vanished from the spotlight, retreating into obscurity, and was rarely seen in public again. The case left an indelible mark on the public consciousness. The media had closely followed every detail of the trial, from the dramatic courtroom exchanges to the emotional testimony of witnesses. It became one of the most talked about criminal trials of the 21st century, drawing comparisons to other high-profile cases, such as that of O.J. Simpson. Many questioned whether justice had truly been served, especially given the jury's decision to acquit Caylee of the most serious charges. For those who followed the case closely, the lack of closure and the unanswered questions about Caylee's death left a painful sense of uncertainty. The fact that no one was held accountable for Caylee's death only intensified the feelings of frustration. In the years following the trial, the case continued to spark debate. Some believed that the evidence was insufficient to convict Caylee, while others remained convinced that she was guilty of her daughter's murder. The case also had a profound impact on public perceptions of the legal system. Many criticized the prosecution for not securing a conviction, while others questioned the role of the media in shaping public opinion before the trial had even begun. Caylee's family also had to cope with the aftermath of the trial. Her parents, George and Cindy Anthony, had stood by her throughout the investigation and trial, believing in her innocence. After the verdict, they too were left to grapple with the emotional aftermath. While they were relieved that their daughter was acquitted of murder, they could not escape the reality of their granddaughter's tragic death. The family remained divided. and the relationship between Casey and her parents was strained. The Caylee Anthony case also brought about significant discussions surrounding child protection laws and the responsibilities of parents. It raised questions about how cases of missing children are handled by authorities and whether more could be done to prevent similar tragedies. For many, the case served as a painful reminder of the vulnerability of children and the importance of vigilance in protecting them. Though the legal case may have concluded, the emotional scars left by Caylee's death and the controversy surrounding her mother's trial remained, leaving a lasting impact on everyone involved. The case of Caylee Anthony remains one of the most tragic and controversial in recent history. It serves as a somber reminder of the vulnerabilities of children and the importance of vigilance and care in their protection. As we reflect on this case, we are reminded of the profound impact such tragedies have on families and communities and the enduring quest for justice.